friends, thanks for tuning in. Ben Ochart here, and I am in the middle of, you guessed it, a water change. Let's talk about water changes. Why do we do them? How often do we do them? And how much water should we change? Let's take a look and discuss the subject. Comment below, and I thank you for tuning in. Let's go. Most freshwater fish keepers will tell you that they do water changes to reduce and control nitrates in their aquarium, and they shoot for numbers like 10 parts per million, 20, or in some cases 40 parts per million. Another school of thought thinks that if you could establish anaerobic bacteria that lives deep in the media, that you could actually create a complete nitrogen cycle where nitrates are actually consumed by that bacteria, and you really wouldn't need water changes for that purpose. But the truth is that water changes actually do more than just reduce nitrates. One of the things that water changes accomplish is that they replace minerals. Minerals suspended in your aquarium eventually settle. They actually settle to the bottom. And what that means is that as nitric acid is created, okay, you know about ammonia, nitrite, and nitrate, which essentially is nitric acid. As that acid is created, the minerals are what tend to neutralize it. This is referred to sometimes as buffering. Well, if you allow those minerals to settle and spend a considerable amount of time between water changes, those minerals will actually settle and no longer be able to neutralize, and you will have a spike in nitrates. Essentially a spike in acid. This will create an aquarium crash and create a drastic change in pH. And that is not something that you want, especially with African cichlids. You want to keep African cichlid pH high, and that means that the acids need to be neutralized or buffered. And this is why many of us we actually add minerals to our water to help with that process, unless your tap water is coming out pretty hard. The water here in Southern California, it's basically liquid rock, and it is pretty mineralized and very, very hard. My pH tends to run at about 7-8 to about 8. And remember that even an increment change in pH is a drastic change, because it is what is called a logarithm. In other words, it increases times 100 times that number. So it increases very, very, very much with just a 1 point change, or decreases very much with a 1 point change. So water changes replenish minerals as well as reduce and remove nitrates. And by keeping those minerals suspended and at a pretty steady amount, you will have a pretty stable pH. And I'm going to cover this more in a upcoming video, in which I'm going to get into water hardness and things like pH and KH and GH and all that good stuff. I'm going to talk about that in a future video, and that ties into this subject of water changes. I tend to change depending on the readings I'm getting. If my nitrates are above 20, and actually in the 20 to 40 range, or maybe even tipping a little bit over 40, I'll do a water change greater than 50%. If my nitrates are around 20, between 10 and 20, I'll usually just change about 25. Keep in mind that when you're messing with your tank, when you're doing things like water changing and changing around decor and things of this nature, you are actually stressing your fish out. So if you can reduce this type of activity and still maintain a healthy environment for your fish, that is recommended. So one of the things I wanted to do was to get some information from the Ben.o.cichlid Facebook group and see what others are doing and what their thoughts are in the area of water changes. As I often do, it started with a survey, in this case, water changes, how much, how often, and why. And one comment said once a week, 50%. Another one, Bob Yates, 30% if the nitrates are good, 40% if the nitrates are close to 40 once a week. Billy Ware says 75% on a weekly basis, while Efren does 60% changes twice a week. That's a lot of work. Trevor does 50% per week. Quite a wide variety of answers. This one says once a week, 50% on my 75-gallon Mabuna and 72 planted tank. Thank God for the Python. Another one said 10% a week. Another one says 30 to 50% weekly if I have the time. Gets the 2-week mark, gotta make time, usually 1 or 2 in the morning. Neighbors probably think I'm on crack. Well, if you saw my cichlids or crack video, you are on crack. Andrew says 30 to 40% water change every 4 to 5 days because I don't know what I'm doing and it sounded appropriate. Well, there's an honest answer. And the answers really have a lot to do with your with other factors. I got really good filtration and not overstocked to 15 to 20% once a month. My canisters once every 4 months. I have a Fluval FX6, Eheim 2217 in each of my 2 tanks. John, also known as Half Man, Half Cichlid, says, I do once a month 60% on African and Amazonian tanks with mature fish every week or so on juvenile grow-out tanks. So you can see here the answers are very much being driven by other factors, which Kevin touches on here. Depends on bioload. There is no general answer for it. Also matters on how much you feed. It's as simple as that. And that actually is probably the guiding point for all of these answers. Gav says once a week, unless I'm busy, then I may have to skip one, usually about 20 to 30%. They make too much of a mess otherwise. I agree. If you keep African cichlids, and you have an overstocked tank, let's say, or a highly stocked tank, you got a mess on your hands. Bobby says 30% tops. Any more than that and pH change shocks my fish. 1 water change per week. I do have 2 big canister filters per tank. Most are FX6 and all my tanks are 150 gallon and up understocked. So again, we have a balancing act here that we have to keep in consideration. Once a month, I do 70 to 80% water change on my 75-gallon cichlid tank. I have a total of 12 fish, so my stock is low. Therefore, the bio load is low. When I do the water change, I clean one of the canister filters out. I have, 2 Sun 304Bs, an Eheim Pro. So my schedule is 1 filter wash, 1 water change, 1 filter wash per month. Byron says twice a week, 30%, with a gravel vac every time and a wipe on the inside of the glass to remove algae. 22 fish and a 90-gallon, just because I can and I want healthy fish. Well, again, we have a wide spectrum of answers. Immortal says once a month. Small tank, need less maintenance, plus fish are no mess. Michael Thompson says depends on how many fish and how often you feed. Now see, this actually is injecting a lot of common sense into the conversation. Alicia says, I do a weekly 80 to 90% water change in my cichlid tank. They poop a lot, and I have a Pleco in there, a poop machine, and keep it overstocked. So again, we're being driven here to some degree by the bioload, and that really is what should be determining. And we're back to Evan. Evan says, when water tests indicate that you should. Now, so this is probably referring to when nitrates start to creep up, you step in and do a water change, perhaps greater than 50%, of course, depending on what your nitrates are out of the tap. And overall, I guess, the comments here, you saw the wide range, and in each of those cases, I'm going to assume that these folks have healthy tanks, tanks where the fish are flourishing and doing well. And so in some ways, it's a matter of, if it's working for you, don't change it. On the other hand, keep in mind water changes, gravel vac, moving to core around, these things do create stress. They can't help but create some shifts in pH. And this is why sometimes you'll see the fish scratching themselves, rubbing against the substrate and rocks, and flashing like that. So really, if you could come up with the best possible solution, in my opinion, it would be one that really is monitoring. And if you have acceptable nitrate levels, certainly don't mess with it. At the same time, you don't want to wait for a crash to actually take action. Because if that happens, chances are you're going to overstress, if not outright kill your fish. For me, I've moved into and evolved sort of into a pattern where every week my tanks get a change of about 25 to 50% if nitrates are where I prefer them to be. And if they creep up a little, I'll do a 50 to 75% water change. And I do test my water from time to time, and I do have other things that are helping, such as plants in the sump, algae scrubbers, things like that. So there you have it. How often do you change your water? How much do you change? And why do you do it that way? Comment below. We all learn from each other. Be sure to rate, share. Thank you so much for tuning in.